You ever feel like some moments weren't meant to be shared, kid? The question hung in the crisp evening air, Mark's voice gravelly yet soft, like the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. I glanced up from the fire, its flickering light dancing across his face, and suddenly I felt small under the weight of his gaze. The three of us, my father, Mark, and I, were tucked away in the heart of the wilderness. The campground was remote, just the way Dad liked it. He always said, "You need to disconnect to connect." But for me, this trip felt more like an exercise in endurance than bonding. At 20, I wasn't exactly eager to spend my weekend in a tent, far from self-service and civilization. Yet here I was, surrounded by towering pines and the distant call of an owl, watching the stars bleed into a velvety night sky. Mark had joined us, as he often did on my father's impromptu adventures. He was Dad's best friend, almost like an uncle to me growing up. But lately something had shifted. It wasn't Mark who had changed. He was the same confident, easygoing man I'd always known. It was me. The fire crackled as Dad rummaged through the supplies, muttering about finding the marshmallows. Mark and I sat across from each other, the glow of the flames casting shadows on his sharp features. He had the kind of face that seemed carved from stone, weathered but not hardened, with streaks of silver running through his dark hair. "You're quieter than usual," he said, leaning back in his chair. His voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Just taking it all in," I replied, my voice steady despite the subtle flutter in my chest. Mark nodded, his eyes holding mine for a moment longer than they should have. There was something unspoken in his look, something that made the air between us feel too warm, too thick. Dad returned with a triumphant, "Found him," and tossed the marshmallows onto the makeshift table. The tension evaporated as quickly as it had come, replaced by the usual banter and laughter that marked our camping trips. The night deepened, and so did the conversations. My father, ever the storyteller, regaled us with tales of his youth. Mark chimed in with his own memories, his laughter deep and genuine. I listened, caught between their camaraderie and my growing awareness of Mark's presence. At some point, Dad excused himself to retrieve more firewood. Mark and I were left alone, the quiet of the forest wrapping around us like a blanket. "You know," Mark began, breaking the silence, "your dad's always been the adventurous one. Me? I'm just along for the ride." I chuckled, unsure how to respond. "Seems like you're doing okay out here." He smiled, a faint curve of his lips that felt personal, almost intimate. "Maybe, but sometimes I think he's trying to teach me something I've been too stubborn to learn." "What's that?" Mark looked at the fire, his expression unreadable. "How to stop running and just be still." His words settled over me like the warmth of the fire. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. As the embers began to dim, Mark shifted in his chair, leaning forward slightly. "You've grown up a lot, you know," he said, his tone softer now. "Thanks, I guess," I replied, caught off guard. "No, really. You got this presence. Confidence, maybe. It suits you." I felt my cheeks flush, thankful for the darkness that hid my reaction. "Well, I guess I've had good role models." Mark chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Careful. Flattery'll get you everywhere." His words felt heavier than they should have, charged with a meaning I couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Dad returned, arms full of wood, breaking whatever spell had begun to form. "All right, let's get this fire roaring again." Mark leaned back, his easygoing demeanor sliding back into place like a well-worn jacket. But as the flames reignited, I caught his glance, brief but lingering, and my pulse quickened. As the fire crackled and the forest hummed its nightly symphony, I sat between the two men, feeling the weight of something I couldn't name. Mark's words echoed in my mind, his presence a constant hum beneath the surface of the evening. The stars above were unchanging, indifferent to the quiet storm brewing inside me. Somewhere deep down, I knew this weekend wouldn't end the way I expected. "Do you ever think about what's beyond all of this?" Mark's voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he were afraid the forest might overhear. The question startled me, cutting through the stillness of the night. My father had gone to bed hours ago, his steady snores drifting faintly from the tent. Mark and I were the only ones left by the dying fire, its embers glowing faintly against the dark. Beyond what? I asked, my voice matching his quiet tone. He gestured vaguely toward the trees, the sky, the stars. Life. Expectations. What everyone thinks you should be. It wasn't the kind of question I'd expected from Mark, a man who always seemed so sure of himself, so grounded. But there was a vulnerability in his words that drew me in, a crack in his usual confidence that felt both surprising and familiar. I think about it all the time, I admitted. But it's easier to keep those thoughts to yourself. People don't always understand. Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the embers. No, they don't. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. There was something unspoken in the air, an undercurrent that had been building since the moment we'd arrived at this campsite. I could feel it in the way Mark's eyes lingered on mine, in the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. You know, he said after a while, you remind me a lot of myself when I was your age. Yeah, I asked, leaning forward slightly. Yeah, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Curious, restless, trying to figure out where you fit in the world. I laughed softly, the sound almost swallowed by the night. Still trying to figure that out. His eyes met mine, and for a moment it felt like he could see right through me. You'll figure it out, he said. Sometimes it just takes the right moment. The fire sputtered, a gust of wind scattering the ash. Mark reached out to adjust the logs, his hand brushing against mine as he did. It was a small touch, brief and seemingly accidental, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled back instinctively, my heart pounding. Sorry, he murmured, his eyes flickering up to meet mine. It's fine, I said quickly, though my voice betrayed me. Mark hesitated, his hand lingering near mine for a moment before pulling away. The air between us felt charged, the kind of tension that demanded to be acknowledged but was too dangerous to name. I should probably get some sleep, I said, standing abruptly. Mark looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Or you could stay a little longer, he said, his voice steady but laced with something I couldn't quite define. I froze, torn between what I knew was right and what I felt in that moment. The way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, made it impossible to move. Mark, I began, but the words caught in my throat. He stood, closing the distance between us in a single step. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice barely audible. I couldn't. The first touch was hesitant, almost shy, a brush of his hand against my cheek, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. My breath hitched as his lips found mine, soft and searching. For a moment, the world fell away, the only sound the quiet hum of the forest and the erratic pounding of my heart. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself sink into the moment, my fears and doubts melting into the warmth of his touch. There was a tenderness in the way he held me, a carefulness that felt almost reverent. But beneath the sweetness, there was something else, a desperation, a hunger that neither of us could deny. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. No, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I don't want to stop. The fire had burned out completely, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to light our faces. Mark cupped my chin, his eyes searching mine. It's not just you, he said. I felt it too. Hearing those words made something inside me unravel. The guilt I'd been clinging to slipped away, replaced by a sense of inevitability. Whatever this was, it had been building for longer than either of us wanted to admit. As our lips met again, the world seemed to hold its breath. Time slowed, and for a fleeting moment, nothing else mattered. Not my father sleeping just feet away, not the consequences that would surely follow. It was reckless. It was wrong, but it was real. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathing hard, Mark rested his forehead against mine. "We should go back," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. I nodded, though the thought of returning to reality felt like a betrayal of the moment we'd just shared. As we made our way to our respective tents, I couldn't help but glance back at him. His silhouette was barely visible in the darkness, but I could feel his presence as strongly as if he were standing beside me. The night was silent, but my mind was anything but. "You've been quiet this morning," my father said, his voice cutting through the crackling of bacon in the pan. I forced a smile, poking at the campfire with a stick. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. Sleep had been elusive the night before, my thoughts a swirling storm of emotions. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Mark's touch again, heard his whispered words. Now, sitting across from him at breakfast, it was as though the air between us carried the weight of what we'd done. Mark kept his head down, focusing on his plate as though the sizzling bacon demanded all his attention. He hadn't spoken much since we'd emerged from our tents. If my father noticed anything unusual, he didn't let on, chattering away about the day's plans. A hike up to a nearby ridge, some fishing afterward. I nodded along, my responses automatic, though my mind was elsewhere. Every stolen glance at Mark felt like a secret slipping closer to the surface. When breakfast was done, Dad wandered off to organize the gear, leaving Mark and me alone by the fire. The silence between us stretched, tense and suffocating. "I shouldn't have," Mark began, his voice low, but I cut him off. "It wasn't just you," I said quickly, though the word sounded more like a defense than an admission. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "That doesn't make it right." "I know," I replied, my throat tight. "But it happened." Mark's eyes met mine, and for a moment, the regret in them was almost enough to undo me. "We can't let it happen again," he said firmly, though his voice wavered at the edges. I nodded, though the ache in my chest made it feel like a betrayal. "I know," I whispered. The hike was grueling, the steep incline leaving little room for conversation. My father led the way, his energy boundless despite the heat. I trailed behind, flanked by Mark, whose presence was both a comfort and a torment. At the summit, the view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretching endlessly, the forest below a sea of green. My father snapped photos, beaming with pride at his find. Mark stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" I said, more to fill the silence than anything else. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it is." The words felt heavy, laden with a meaning I couldn't quite grasp. That night, after the fire had burned low and Dad had retreated to his tent, Mark lingered, sitting across from me in the dim glow of the embers. The forest was alive with its nocturnal symphony, but the sound only seemed to amplify the tension between us. "I've been thinking," Mark said, breaking the silence. "About last night?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I should have stopped. I should have been better." "You don't need to carry all the blame," I said. "I made a choice too." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "But I should have known better," he said, his voice cracking. "Your dad. He trusts me. And you." He trailed off, shaking his head. "And me?" I prompted, my heart hammering. Mark's shoulders slumped, the weight of his guilt visibly pulling him down. "You deserve better than this." "Better than me?" The words stung more than I wanted to admit. "Maybe I do," I said, my voice soft. "But that doesn't change what I feel." The trip ended the next morning, the campsite dismantled and packed away with efficient precision. My father was in high spirits, already planning our next adventure as we loaded the car. Mark was quieter than usual, his smiles forced, his laughter hollow. As we drove home, the landscape blurred past the windows, but my thoughts were anything but distant. The memory of Mark's touch, his words, lingered like an ache I couldn't shake. When we arrived at Mark's house, he climbed out of the car, hesitating before closing the door. He glanced at me through the window, his expression a mix of longing and regret. "Take care, Adrian," he said softly, his voice carrying more weight than the simple words should have. I nodded, unable to speak. As the car pulled away, my father obliviously humming along to the radio, I stared out the window, my reflection overlaying the passing scenery. The guilt sat heavy in my chest, but so did something else, a strange, bittersweet sense of clarity. Some moments I realized weren't meant to be shared. They were meant to shape you, to remind you that life is messy, imperfect, and sometimes painfully beautiful. And as the road stretched ahead, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever truly be able to leave this one behind.